Order. Andrew Lewis to move the motion.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Henderson. A great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship for the first time, I think. I beg to move that this House has considered independent school fees and VAT. I'd like to put on record my thanks to the Independent Schools Council and their superb Chief Executive, Julie Robinson, not only for the tireless campaigning work they do for the independent education sector, but also for their work as the Secretariat for the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Independent Education, which I've been the chair of since I founded that group when I moved from being an MEP to an MP back in 2017. And I've got a number of independent schools that serve my constituents, including Quinton House, Bosworth School and Northampton High School for Girls, and One School Global. Mr. Henderson, over 600,000 children are educated in the independent schools sector here in the UK, saving UK taxpayers more than £4 billion each year because those pupils are not educated in the state sector. And in addition, the independent sector has a total economic footprint that amounts to £16.5 billion, supporting 328,000 jobs, £5.1 million in tax revenue. So why is it that the sector often gets a bad press despite its contribution to society, both economically and educationally? Well, I think for many people, when they hear the term independent school or private school, they immediately associate those terms with elitism and isolation and privilege. But nothing could be further from the truth. Independent schools today are modern and diverse and inclusive places that often provide education and specialist provision where the state sector doesn't go. And furthermore, independent schools are more connected to society now than ever before, working with state sector in partnerships and widening access through bursaries.
Would my honourable friend give way?
Indeed.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way, and can I congratulate him on securing this really important debate and this important topic. Our independent schools do vital outreach work with access bursaries and access to sports facilities. Many hard-working families up and down the land make huge sacrifices saving to send their children to independent schools. Does my honourable friend agree with me that this short-sighted Labour policy on VAT on independent schools will compromise these schools, force some parents to take their children out of these schools, and ultimately put more pressure on our local state schools?
I thank my honourable friend for that question, which is indeed the major sort of thrust of what I have to say. As chair of the All-Party Group, I'm delighted every year to sponsor the Independent Schools Council's annual Celebrating Partnerships report, where parliamentarians and stakeholders from across the sector come together to celebrate that fantastic work that the independent sector does in partnership. 75% of independent schools are now in partnerships with state schools. And that's not the old swimming pool, every other Tuesday afternoon for an hour or two. Those are embedded, mutually beneficial partnerships. Given how influential and impactful the sector is for wider society, therefore, it's in disappointment that I stand in opposition to the Labour Party's policy position on independent education, the introduction of a 20% VAT fee on independent school fees, and in urging the current government and my Conservative Party colleagues to be robust in their stance of not imposing VAT on school fees, and I look forward to the Minister's analysis of that. However, given the opposition are currently well ahead in the polls, and it's at least possible that they could form a government in the next Parliament, it's important that this debate has been granted, and it's important that we take the time to scrutinise what I believe is an ill-thought-out policy. And whilst I welcome the fact that Labour's plans for independent education under the member for Holborn and St Pancras are not as draconian and undemocratic, and indeed questionable in law, as they were when he served in the shadow cabinet of the member for Islington North, when it looked like the party was trying to abolish the sector entirely, they're still very worrying indeed. To start with, the principle of parental choice is supported by Article 2 of the first protocol of the European Convention on Human Rights, which was incorporated into domestic law by the 1998 Human Rights Act. The state shall respect the rights of parents to ensure such education and teaching in conformity with their own religious and philosophical convictions. However, is this right to choose being assisted if said choice is made increasingly difficult and harder for parents to make via a huge tax rise. I don't think it is. It's also a fundamental principle that we don't tax the supply of education. The VAT Act of 1994 exempts education, including nurseries and universities, alongside independent schools. And that principle is international in scope. The UK would be an outlier if Labour abandoned that policy. EU nations, Australia and the USA, for example, don't apply sales taxes to education. And beyond these core principles, there's many reasons why the policy could be harmful and doomed to fail. Firstly, parents that are resident in the UK and make the decision to send their children to independent schools already contribute to the state education sector by paying their fair share of taxes. And I've made this very clear in the Chamber when debating this subject. The repeated use of terms such as tax breaks and tax reliefs should be avoided. Independent schools are taxed in the same way as other education providers and charities are, and they provide more than £5 billion in tax annually, more than 3 times what Labour think they'll raise from VAT. UK parents paying school fees are doing so from already taxed income.
Yeah.
Now the Labour Party put this policy forward, I'm sure we'll hear today because it believes in educational excellence for everyone and not a reserved few. But by introducing this policy, a Labour government would simply be making independent schools even more elite than they perceive them to be already by pricing out hard-working parents who can just about afford to pay the fees in order to invest in their children's futures. Those that can easily absorb the 20% will do so, and perhaps that's what the Labour Party wants, to make private schools more elite so that it's more difficult for politicians like me to make the case for them. And I'll use the jacuzzi and private jet analogy here to demonstrate my point. You may never have a jacuzzi in your garden, but many of us would probably be able to afford to install one if we chose to do so. A private jet, on the other hand, is for virtually everyone a sort of unobtainable fantasy for a distant elite with no connection to our lives. And that's what Labour wants independent education to be, the private jet, not the jacuzzi. That's purely figurative, of course, as a parallel, and not a relationship to the importance, the crucial importance of educational choice. It's been said that these aren't issues that we should worry about, that independent schools can simply absorb the VAT increase so that they don't pass them on to parents. But that's a naive view, with many independent schools up and down the country being very small, operating on tight margins, unable to do that. A quarter of all schools in the Independent Schools Council have fewer than 155 pupils. They're not wealthy institutions able to absorb VAT. They're small community schools. Yes, yes, indeed.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and I congratulate him on securing this really important debate. Several head teachers of independent schools in my constituency of Woking have come to me and said that they are worried that many parents won't be able to afford to keep their children at a school if VAT, and 1 or 2 are worried about the future of their schools. In my honourable friend's conversations with the independent sector and the groups representing them, have Labour taken into account the fact that there might be a massive increase in students having to go to the state sector, schools closing, and that would completely kibosh any potential financial gains they're claiming?
Indeed, it would. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And your point leads me nicely into the fact that the naivety of their position is underlined by the fact that I believe there's a sort of hidden agenda here in terms of schools in the Midlands and the North, smaller schools closing and being absorbed by the state. And underlining this is perhaps the fact that the Shadow Education Secretary, since taking up her post in 2021, hasn't visited an independent school, at least with the aim or with the willingness to discuss the impact of her policy. You say that you've spoken to people in the sector. Obviously, I and I know many other people here have done so. The unwillingness to engage speaks volume. Who would propose massive changes to the chemical industry or the high street retail industry without actually taking the trouble to speak to people involved in that sector and assess the impact of it. It's quite unthinkable. And I'd also question why the policy is aimed only at taxing the supply of children's education, arguably the most pivotal, and not an education for adults via universities, for example, or other forms of education such as private tutoring, which is the alternative private education leg up, provision of extra advantage that many on the left, as well as not on the left, utilise. No plans for VAT there. Wonder why. Perhaps most importantly of all is the effect this will have on independent schools' ability to operate. If those independent schools can't absorb the VAT increase, or parents can't afford the fees, many of them would have to close. And that will be disastrous for two important reasons. The first is we'd see those children go into the state sector, increasing the burden on other children and teachers. And I know the opposition believes this can be offset by funds raised via this policy, but we're yet to see any consensus on the true impact. The Institute for Fiscal Studies themselves say the policy will raise a figure £500 million less than Labour have committed in spending pledges. The education specialist think tank EDSK puts the likely revenue even lower, leaving Labour more than £1 billion overdrawn on their spending plans. And most worrying is the IFS finding that the evidence of impact on children and families is, to quote them, quite thin, alongside 30-year-old data that they relied on of the experience of Catholic schools in America. So it's tax first and repent later. I'm sure we'll hear this as a bogus claim that there might not be some sort of mass exodus, and that might be evidenced by the fact that as inflation has risen and independent school fees have gone up, we've not seen many children leave the sector. However, the ISC has found that 20% of parents who currently send their children to independent schools say that they will be priced out and have to educate their children in the state sector. These are the parents who will be making this difficult choice and may be forced into pulling their children out of schools that they've been educated in prior and are at a key stage in their education. And perhaps most strikingly, the Baines-Cutler report has calculated, using real data from schools and parents, that the predicted income later drop-off, if this policy was enacted, would be nearly 100,000 children wide. 1/6 of all children educated in the sector who need somewhere, therefore, to be educated. Even more crucial is the impact on independent schools that provide specialist provision where the state sector doesn't go. Independent specialist schools with small budgets educating children with particular needs. DFE data shows that there are over 100,000 pupils receiving SEN support in independent schools, some with EHCPs, some without. And moreover, many independent schools provide specialist faith schooling or provision for military families, something I saw the benefit of in my own education. When it comes to SEND provision specifically, what we'll see is parents who can no longer afford to pay the fees will seek out an EHCP if they haven't got one, which is going to lead to more pressure on families, more pressure on local authorities at tribunal and on local authority budgets. And I'd be interested to know whether there's been any realistic impact assessment about that. If those schools were to close as a result of this policy, those children won't have the provision they need, and it'll be very much the case that those schools will have to stop providing the excellent partnership that they do in order to cover costs, or reducing the offer of bursaries to disadvantaged pupils, reducing social mobility, making those institutions even more elite, which is the point. It's a regressive tax that will only seek to harm independent schools on the tightest of margins. And even if those policies' impacts are not seen immediately, I fear the long-term negative consequences will be dire. It's those schools they're not thinking about that are going to be hardest hit, small faith schools, special needs schools. That capacity sees some special needs support for 96,000 children who are not on an EHCP. Now, Labour have exempted EHCP pupils from VAT on fees, but not on other students with special educational needs. That's 96,000 children facing disrupted education, state provision further stretched, and worse for all those needing it. And families incentivised, therefore, to apply for EHCPs. So Labour should exempt all pupils with special educational needs from VAT on fees. If they don't, the pressures will be laid at their door. And similarly, small faith schools up and down the country couldn't be further from the stereotype that's been presented. They often charge low fees, often lower than to the taxpayer than the cost of local state schools, because they're supported by local congregations and voluntary efforts. They're frequently very small. They can't absorb VAT, and their families and supporters can't find 20% more at a moment's notice. They'll face deficit and closure, and they'll be harder hit than the better-known schools that I'm sure many have in their heads when they're proposing this. And there's a slow burn issue as well, with parents perhaps persisting for an extra year or two for a child that's in the middle, but then not making a decision to go ahead for a child that hasn't entered the system yet. But there's also a danger of smaller schools becoming insolvent, having to assess that the increased risks of becoming technically insolvent through this enables them not to be able to try and struggle on and push through. It needs to be considered in the round, not just as a standalone. And given that we've heard hardly anything else in terms of supporting education from the Labour Party, I'm not sure voters are presented with very much. So to conclude, Mr Henderson, independent schools provide a vital role in educating our children. They provide specialist provision and excellent partnership work. The Labour Party wants to pull all this up and pull it at risk for the sake of raising a very questionable £1.5 billion, which will not be enough to offset the damage it will inflict. So I hope those listening who are in positions to influence this will take these points away, and I look forward to the Treasury Minister's further thoughts about the VAT details. We need to ensure this ill-thought-out policy does not put unnecessary strain on hard-working families that want a better future for their children. Thank you.
Hear, hear. Well said.
I would remind members that they should bob if they wish to speak. I'm going to have to put a time limit of 3 minutes on it, because we're going to have to call the opposition spokesman at 5:15. The question is that this House has considered independent school fees and VAT, and I'll call Sally Ann Hart.
Thank you, Mr Henderson, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I congratulate the Honourable Member for Northampton South for securing this important debate. Labour's plans to charge VAT and end business rate relief for independent schools is based in the politics of envy and from a party that wants to crush aspiration and ambition. Labour says their primary motivation is to generate revenue to invest in the state education system, and that the policy might raise £1.7 billion to do so. Well, Labour better get building more schools, Mr Henderson, because they intend to implement this policy as soon as Sir enters Downing Street with no consultation or risk analysis. What a nonsense. The policy will harm both the state and the independent sector, and there will be an exodus of pupils into an increasingly stretched state system, with some independent schools closing altogether. Do not trust Labour with our schools. About 12 years ago, an OECD report, Education at a Glance, found that expenditure on schools as a percentage of GDP increased from 3.6% in 1995 to 4.5% in 2009. The OECD average was 4%. Billions of pounds of spending went into schools under the last Labour government, but this huge increase in spending led to no improvement in student learning outcomes. UK teenagers slipped down the league tables in crucial subjects, whilst our schools became the most segregated across the world, with Britain's immigrant children clustered in the most disadvantaged schools. Primary school class sizes were bigger only in places like Turkey and Chile, and there was an alarming rise in children, not in education, employment or training. Taxpayers failed to get value for money, and Labour's policies had little impact. Labour will never understand that it's not just about money, it's about leadership and structure. And we have some amazing head teachers in Hastings and Rye, and I'll not name them, but they know who they are, and they work best with the support of positive and effective government policy, as well as from their academy trusts. 32% of schools were rated as good or outstanding in Hastings and Rye in 2010, compared to 82% in 2022. There is more work to do, but this can be done, as we've seen from the Conservative government's record, without destroying our valuable independent sector. I have got 2 independent schools in my constituency of beautiful Hastings and Rye, Claremont and Buxwood. Buxwood boards about 50 pupils from 48 different countries and has 200 local day school pupils. Both of them have lower fees for local children, and they have diverse mix of children which contribute to a rich cultural environment, one which would not normally be expected in a coastal community. And so they enrich our communities to the benefits of all our residents.
I apologise, first of all, to Jim Shannon and Munira Wilson for not having called them earlier. So, Munira Wilson, please.
Thank you very much, Mr Henderson. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and can I congratulate the Honourable Member for Northampton South for securing this debate. I and my Liberal Democrat colleagues aspire to a scenario where the offering in all of our state schools is so high, so superior, that parents don't feel compelled or the need to send their children to the independent sector. An education system that enables every individual, no matter what their background or what their needs, to be able to flourish and succeed and fulfil their potential wherever they're educated. But as Liberals, we are also a party that has always championed choice. And it's important that parents are able to choose where their parents are educated, and independent schools should always be one of those choices. And let me be clear, we do not support ending the VAT exemption for independent schools for the very simple reason that we do not support taxing education. As we've already heard, all education provided by an eligible body, including things like universities, music lessons, tutoring sessions, are exempt from VAT. And we would not want to see VAT or any tax charged on any of these things. But there does, Mr Henderson, need to be a quid pro quo. Independent schools should give back to their local community in order to retain that right. And, as we've heard, many already do. And there are many excellent examples of collaborative work around the country. In my own constituency, Hampton School and Lady Eleanor Hollis have an exemplary partnership with Reach Academy in Feltham, sharing staff time, mentoring, coaching pupils for medical school and other university places. It's about partnership and sharing not just swimming pools and theatre spaces, but also, as I've said, those specialist teachers, specialist facilities. That sort of ingrained partnership work benefits both the state sector and the independent sector, and it needs to become the norm for all. Removing the VAT exemption from independent schools would reduce this partnership work, and it would also hit parents who have felt that the state sector, for whatever reason, can't meet their children's needs. If they've got additional needs and don't have any HCP, I know of many examples where parents have scrimped and saved or used a little bit of inheritance that they may have got from their parents to be able to send their child who isn't thriving in a state school, who's able to thrive in the independent sector. And as we've heard, many schools are not the Eatons, the Winchesters and the Harrows. Many are small schools with fewer than 400 pupils. So we should all be aspiring to make the best investment we can in education, every school as good as possible, and taxing education is not the way to achieve this goal. Thank you.
Paul Scully.
Thank you very much, Mr Henderson. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I'll congratulate my honourable friend, member from Northamptonshire South for securing this debate. My register of interest, I'll declare an interest of 3 types. My partner is a head teacher at a prep school. She also owns a house that backs onto one of the best performing state schools in Surrey, so inevitably her house price will go up when this becomes a selection by house price rather than by academia or fees. And I also went to an independent school. My father paid a fortune for this accent, but there's 2 things I would say. First of all, economically, it's not sensibly. Educationally, it's not sensible either. Prep schools in particular, they're already a very fragile ecosystem. Most prep schools are around 150, 250 pupils. And so my honourable friend was talking about an impact assessment of what happened if you start having a few people drift. I'll tell you what happens. If you have 10 pupils, 15 pupils comes from a fragile prep school that may be not paying market price for their salaries, teachers' salaries, that have already opted out of TPS, which, by the way, is 28% or so of salaries. The independent schools are the only people actually paying in. It's a Ponzi scheme, and some actuaries are predicting it to go to 40% because if you get more failure. If you get 10, 15 pupils leaving those sort of schools, the school collapses. You then get 150 pupils in that area having to get educated under the state system. If it's a rural area, when you have a small state school at that point, you may have 1.1 million vacancies in state schools around the country. They're not equally distributed. You've got something like 20-odd% of secondary schools that are over capacity. They're the best ones. They're the ones that people want to get into at the moment. And the prep schools in particular, they're already fragile, the ones that go up to 13, they're already having to change their business model. This is another nail in the coffin of that aspiration for people and pupils, as we've already heard. It's not lifting life chances, it's just setting one group of children over another. The smaller amount of money that you're absolutely going to raise in reality by this policy is just not going to be as meaningful as the Labour Party thinks to make that broad change. So it's better to look for other more collaborative ways, but let's not destroy the partnership working that we've already heard about. Let's not destroy the working that we have around using different sites, different sporting facilities, different expertise, different skills. Because you already have the fact that the IFS report talks about, it tends to be concentrated at the top of the income and wealth, but tends to is actually doing a lot of heavy lifting in there. There's a lot of people who are struggling to make sure their children get a better education, and we should make sure that we reflect on that, and that the shadow Secretary of State for Education goes out and actually meets some head teachers.
Jim Shannon.
I, first of all, congratulate you, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. Can also congratulate the Honourable Gentleman for Northampton South for raising this issue. In Northern Ireland, schooling is slightly different in that we still have a transfer test which allows entrance into grammar schools, and for this reason, I don't believe that there is as great a preference of private schools as one may see were grammar schools to be removed. But I am thankful that the DUP, with the now working Assembly, has a minister in place to protect the education system and retain grammar education for people of all classes and backgrounds. Just declare an interest, Mr. Chairman, when back in the 60s, because I can go back probably further than nearly anybody in this chamber, and whenever I attended school, my mum and dad sent me to a boarding school in Coleraine. They gave me 5 years of good education. I'm incredibly indebted to my mum and dad because I knew they had to, in the 60s especially. There was no holidays. The car was never, their banger was kept forever, just so that their sons could have an education. So I thank them for that, and it gave me a great chance in this ward, and I appreciate it. To go back to the debate, with that being so, I do not think that the drive towards taxing private schools out of existence is a route to take either. It is clear that the education of children is something that is charitable in the extreme, and the only profits as such that are made are found in well-rounded children and well-paid teaching staff. This should be the goal for every school. That's what we should be looking at, and no other reason. I don't believe that we should achieve this goal by seeing fees rise to an extent that only the most elite can afford schooling, such as schools in Switzerland. And that would be an example. The boarding school that is on the periphery of my constituency of Strangford is Rockport in North Down constituency. It draws a number of international students to its doors, and this can only be good for the local area. The money that it generates, the cultural exchanges and the social engagement that it does as well. I would hate to see this great school with its head teacher, Mr George Vance, who cut his teeth at our local grammar school, Regent House in my constituency, being left in a position whereby the fees rise at an exorbitant rate and the benefits of this school are lost. That would be a tragedy. There are 16 private schools registered in Northern Ireland, and I do believe that there's a role for the sector. I do believe that the work that they do deserves support, and not what appears to be setting out to tear the sector down by stealth taxation. I'm a believer in the public school system. My boys all went to Glassy High School. My granddaughters go to the local integrated school. My grandsons are in the local primary school. I have faith, Mr Chairman, in the schooling system. And this doesn't mean that I want the abolition of those smaller subsidised schools. This VAT proposal is not only designed against the ultra-wealthy. It will go much further than that, and that concerns me. It concerns me that with great respect to what Labour are putting forward, will have a detrimental effect to the education and to the economy of this great nation of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Thank you.
Aaron Henry.
Henderson. I'd like also to thank my honourable friend, member for Northampton South, for bringing this debate. Of course, we'll focus on consequences of removing the current exemption independent schools have from VAT. It's clear that this change would lead to a rise in school fees as schools are forced to pass on the cost to parents in order for schools to be able to keep running. This would immediately mean that many parents who may only just be able to afford the fees as they stand would no longer be able to continue sending their children to private school. In fact, one of the local Nottinghamshire high schools I've calculated, they would lose around 20% of their children. Smaller schools would struggle to survive at that rate and may close. This would mean job losses and loss of choice for local parents regarding their child's education. I was contacted recently by my constituent, Dr. Shamini, who is a local school governor and is incredibly concerned about this potential change. She emphasised to me that it is not the most wealthy and their children who will be affected, but rather those parents who work incredibly hard and make sacrifices in order to send their children to independent schools. It is important to emphasise this would also have a knock-on effect on current non-fee paying schools who would see an increase in pupils. This could mean larger class sizes and greater resources being required in non-fee paying schools. This may also cause children having to move schools in very short time spans. I'm a veteran. This is the sort of thing that would affect military families as well, having to move mid-school year, etc. And they make good use of independent schools because of that, and boarding schools. So it's mentioned that this will have a large effect on the lives of children having to move. We are removing children from their teachers, friends, and for many that will be very distressing. My team spoke with the head of a local private school in Nottinghamshire today. He had huge concerns about the way they currently use facilities at the school. As it stands, facilities such as halls and sports facilities are given to a huge variety of local clubs at no cost. However, he stated that if VAT was to come in for them, they would be forced to look at more economical ways of renting out those spaces and would not be able to financially continue lending those spaces out for free. He also wished to emphasise the difference between the big private boarding schools and smaller independent day schools. It is the small independent schools that will be hurt the most by this change, and many may not survive the loss of the students. So this focus of all members in this House must be making sure every child has the best possible education they can have. That is what I'll be focusing in on Broxton.
Yeah. Point of order, Sally Ann Hart.
Yes, thank you. I neglected to say that I might have an interest as my husband is a governor of an independent school.
Noted. Thank you. David Simmons.
Thank you, Mr Henderson, and a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship this afternoon, and I add my congratulations to the member for Northampton South for securing the debate. I represent a constituency which has 5 thriving independent schools that are of the traditional private school nature, as well as numerous settings which are either state schools that as academies are independent schools, and a significant number of private SEND provision and private nursery provision. And my children have benefited both from state, private and privately funded state provision over the years, so I do have a direct interest in the subject matter of the debate. I wanted to focus in particular on the impact that VAT would have on the very large sector of small independent schools that we have in this country, on which so many parents rely. It is a rule of Ofsted that any setting which has 2 or more children present for the purposes of their education has to be registered as a school. And in my constituency, I have a stables, an equine centre, which provides equine therapy for mute autistic children who are reliant on that because that is an environment in which they can gain educational benefit placed there and funded by the local authority, which is simply not to be found in any other form of schooling. Across the country, there are a huge number of such schools. They are schools legally registered with an Ofsted number, and they are privately funded. Many of them are not charitable trusts. They are, in some cases, businesses that are able to provide a particular type of apprenticeship or educational experience for a very specific set of special educational needs. And the impact of introducing VAT on the fees paid by local authorities and the fees paid by parents on this huge variety of provision will be absolutely enormous. And it's very clear from a number of constituents of mine who have children with quite profound special educational needs that they're deeply concerned about the impact this would make, not just on their household budgets, but on the availability of that very specific, very specialist provision which they depend on. I also have some sympathy with the argument that the element of education, which is hotel costs in boarding schools, is not strictly an educational purpose, and I've heard that advanced across the sector. It's very clear that the availability of that highly specialised private provision would be profoundly jeopardised by the imposition of a policy of VAT on all of those fees, a cost that would hit directly the taxpayer and would mean that so many of our constituents who at last, often after many years searching for the right setting for a child with those profound needs, feel they found it, are then now seeing that that would be put at risk by a policy of VAT being introduced. So I commend the government in strongly resisting it, and I hope the Minister will restate that resistance again this afternoon.
Suella Braverman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise to thank my honourable friend for leading this debate because, frankly, this Labour Party policy is a viciously cynical ploy to allow Labour to masquerade as class warriors, as the working class heroes in Britain, taking on the elite. But the reality is that they are the champagne socialists pretending to be the social justice champions, because this policy is not about education. It's not about outcomes and welfare of children. It's not about supporting the British people. This is about division. This is about removing choice. It will harm educational outcomes and it will cause hardship. And far from being the class warriors of our age, Labour will become the party that kills off social mobility through this tax on aspiration, this tax on personal choice and responsibility, this tax on social mobility. And there are three reasons why this is misguided. Firstly, independent schools are positive for the economy. They contribute £16 billion to the economy. They support 300,000 jobs, contributing £5 billion in tax revenue. And they save the taxpayer £4 million by educating pupils outside the state sector. All that would be put at risk by this ill-thought-out policy. Secondly, special education schools will be hard hit by this punitive policy. There are 96,000 pupils at SEND schools who are not on an EHCP, and they will be put at risk by this policy, simply put. Where will these children go when those special schools are put out of business? Many specialist schools in the state sector are already oversubscribed. And lastly, this tax on aspiration will simply push many poorer pupils out of good quality schools. And parental choice will be destroyed. And I feel very passionate about this policy and stand against it because of my own personal educational journey. And we'll all have personal experiences and views informed by our own education. But mine is very opposite. My parents were working class people. They were migrants who came here with nothing. They themselves had very poor educations in Mauritius and Kenya, and so they valued the opportunity to give me a good chance at getting educated. I started in a local state school where the teachers would go on strike every week, where the outcomes were poor and where discipline was bad. But my parents, therefore, had the choice, and through scrimping and saving and sacrifice, they got me into a small, independent private school. And from that school, I got into Cambridge, I practiced as a barrister, and I made it to Parliament. Mr. Chairman, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the sacrifice, and I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the great, small private school that my parents had the choice to send me to. Thank you.
Thank you. Robin Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Henderson, and I congratulate my honourable friend for securing this important debate. I want to speak in the capacity as Chair of the Education Select Committee, and this is slightly awkward because, of course, we don't look at policies which are not government proposals. But, of course, we had a debate about a year ago in the Chamber of the House of Commons where the Labour Party had proposed to bypass my committee and appoint their own one in order to look at this policy proposal. What was interesting in that debate, as in this one, was how few Labour backbenchers turned up to support what is supposed to be their flagship policy. This continues to be an issue that has not been raised during my time as chairman of the Education Select Committee by any of the Labour members of that committee, and I find that in the circumstances very surprising. This is an issue that I am primarily concerned about because its impact on our publicly funded schools, and I do seriously worry that they haven't done their sums properly, that the impact of the £6,000 a year funding required for the revenue funding alone, let alone the capital expense of expanding those schools, hasn't been brought into their calculations. My county council are currently in the process of commissioning a £40 million secondary school to meet the demand for places that we already have. No calculation appears to have been conducted as to what the cost of the extra places required by this policy would be. When it comes to SEND, now I expect the Labour frontbench spokesman to say that they will exempt specialist settings from their VAT proposal. I certainly hope that was the case, and that was what was indicated in our previous debate. But I don't think the revenue calculations carried out by the Treasury some years ago on the basis of imposing 20% VAT on all charges for independent schools have taken that into account. So I would love it if she could update us in today's debate about what is the reduction in the income Labour expect if they do exempt those specialist settings from this. And also, will that apply to all of them, including the AP settings, such as my honourable friend beside me referred to, and indeed one of which I recently visited in my honourable friend from Mid-Worcestershire's constituency at the Glover's Peace mini farms. They would like the assurance that they're not going to be clobbered by a 20% increase in VAT and in fees. When it comes to SEND pupils, we are not just talking about those in specialist settings. Many of my mainstream independent schools in Worcester provide support to pupils who identify special educational needs but who do not have an EHCP. If those people are driven out of the independent sector by higher fees, they are likely to be seeking EHCPs and putting pressure on a system which is already overloaded when it comes to our health system and our local authorities, one which I will campaign along with colleagues to try and increase the resources for. As chairman of the Education Select Committee, I want our state education system to be one of the best in the world. It already is, but we can make it even better, and we should focus on doing that rather than creating the misleading impression that by clobbering the independent sector, by imposing a VAT taxation which no Labour government in the last century has ever proposed to introduce, and that none of our European or English-speaking peers apply to independent education, that this is somehow the solution.
I now call on the opposition spokesperson.
Thank you very much, Mr Henderson. It's a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today. I'd like to congratulate the Honourable Member for Northampton South for bringing forward this debate today on independent schools and VAT. Many members have made contributions today about the role that independent schools play in their communities. Indeed, in my own constituency of Dulwich and West Norwood, thousands of children receive a high-quality education at independent schools, including Dulwich College, James Allen's Girls' School, Herne Hill School and Allane's School and others besides. I will address in my remarks some of the comments that have been made by honourable and right honourable members this afternoon. But I'd say to the honourable member for Northampton South, in his analogy of the difference between private schools that are private jets or jacuzzis, that in that analogy, we would want every school to represent and fulfil the aspirations that parents have for their children. And this is at the nub of this debate. This is a debate about the quality for the 93% of children who attend state schools in relation to the quality of education for the... I'm going to make some progress, I'm afraid. I'm not taking interventions right away. In relation to the quality of education that is received by a privileged 7% of children. We all want the best education for our children. Every single parent wants the best education for their child. And that's why the next Labour government will do what previous Labour governments have done. We will drive up standards in our schools, and we will put education back at the centre of our national life again, so we can break down the barriers to opportunity across our country. This debate is focused specifically, well, I don't know who was chuntering from the sedentary position about what happened last time. As a London MP, I can tell you exactly what happened last time. It was called the London Challenge, and it transformed education in my constituency and across London in the state sector from a situation where our schools were failing under the Conservatives and to a situation where they are now delivering brilliantly for all of our children.
As many of you have mentioned, as many honourable members have mentioned, this debate is, the Labour Party is committed to levying VAT on independent schools and ending their business rates exemptions. We have committed to do this because we believe in driving high and rising standards in all of our schools. Across this country, more than 9 in 10 children attend state schools. The independent Institute for Fiscal Studies reported last year on policies around VAT and tax exemptions for private schools. In brief, it found that our proposals would have little effect on the number of children being educated in private schools, but it would lead to a net gain to the public purse of at least £1.3 billion per year. I appreciate some of the concerns that have been raised in this debate today, but I would urge honourable and right honourable members to look in more detail at the IFS report's findings.
I'll press the opposite front bench on a very specific point, which is there are some brilliant special schools in my constituency. The opposition are saying they will exempt children within ECHP from their tax, but they're not saying they'll exempt all children at special schools from the tax. Why not?
There is a very simple reason for that. That is the way that we avoid a loophole whereby any school can claim that it is a special school. Any school could, without there being an independent test of the places that are provided, any school could claim that they were a special school, and that would provide a loophole that we don't. I'm not going to give away again. That would provide a loophole that schools could use to evade the policy. The share of pupils being educated in private schools has consistently remained around 6 to 7%, despite fees increasing above inflation year on year for many years. Indeed, independent school fees are 55% higher now in real terms than 20 years ago. And while we don't believe the scaremongering that there will be an exodus of pupils into the state sector, our state schools would be able to cope with an increase in their numbers. Across England, overall pupil numbers are due to decline by at least 100,000 per year until 2030, a total drop which is higher than the number of children currently attending private schools. The Labour Party believes in parental choice. I'll give way to the Chair of the Select Committee.
I'm grateful to giving way. Just to point that, yes, the overall numbers are declining, and that is primarily in primary. The demographic bulge, as she well knows, is coming through into secondary, and secondary schools in many areas of the country are full. How do they plan to deal with that?
Well, as he rightly points out, what happens in primary flows into secondary. And so secondary schools across the country, secondary schools in my constituency are absolutely aware of that drop in numbers that is coming down the track. And we are seeing secondary schools in London closing, two of them this year, because that flow is starting to affect them. The Labour Party believes in parental choice, but this conversation today has to take place with fairness in mind. In 2022-23, average independent school fees were £15,200, but the average state school spending per pupil was £8,000. This is a gap in funding between independent and state school spending, which has more than doubled since 2010. With the £1.3 billion in funding each year that would be raised from our measures, we could significantly increase school spending, allowing the government to drive high standards across our state schools too. The government is consistently missing its targets for teacher recruitment and faces teachers leaving the profession in droves. So we would use this money to recruit and retain more than 6,500 additional teachers. There is considerable evidence of the need for and the benefit from improving teacher training. So Labour will work with schools to deliver a teacher training entitlement throughout every stage of a teacher's career to deliver evidence-based, high-quality professional development. We need to look again at school inspection and improvement. Oh, okay.
Minister.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Henderson. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And please allow me to start by congratulating my honourable friend, the member for Northampton South, for securing the debate today. What a pity we've only had 60 minutes, because there is so much more to say here, because we've had some fascinating and thoughtful contributions on this matter of independent schools fees and VAT. And it will be no surprise to anybody to hear that I agree wholeheartedly with friends and colleagues on this side of the chamber, and actually very pleased to hear the support as well from our Lib Dem and DUP colleagues as well, who support the government's policy to allow independent school fees to be exempt from VAT for the many, many valid and obvious reasons expressed by honourable members and right honourable members today, including the incredible impact they have on our communities, the partnering, and of course the impact they have on so many people's lives, as well as the fundamental principle of choice. I'm afraid what we've heard from the opposition and what we hear consistently, though perhaps we might all be sighing a sigh of relief soon when we get the inevitable flip-flopping on this policy, because I don't believe for 1 minute that this policy is wholeheartedly supported by all members opposite. But it's just virtue signalling of the highest order. It is complete left-wing populist virtue signalling by the opposition. But the British public see straight through it. Because, Mr. Chairman, this government understands the vital role that education plays in all of our lives. Just this year, school funding will total about £57.7 billion. Next year, school funding will be at £59.6 billion. Very proud to say that that will be the highest ever level in real-term spending per pupil under the Conservatives.
I'm extremely grateful to the Minister agreeing. Well, I learned as a shadow minister and as a minister it's better to be gracious. The Minister will understand that one of the best arguments for independent schools is that they often innovate. My right honourable friend from Fareham was involved in establishing a school, indeed, which innovates and broke new ground. From the Steiner schools to Bedales to Summerhill, those schools can only exist in the independent sector. So how does he think the Labour Party perceives that, or don't they perceive it at all?
Yes, well, my right honourable friend, as always, talks very sensibly about this. The independent sector is a major contributor to our ecosystem. Of course, many teachers flip-flop between the different sectors, and of course the innovation in the private sector can also help the state sector. It's one of the many benefits we've heard of today. And then in terms of the broader performance in the education system, we hear consistently from the opposition, not only do they talk the economy down, our constituents down and our businesses down, they also talk our teaching profession down, because actually it is incredibly successful and we should be proud of what they have achieved. Our commitment to quality education has seen 89% of all schools achieve good or outstanding at their most recent inspection, an increase from 68% back in 2010 under Labour. And in the international PISA assessments, our rankings for reading and maths improved by 10 places from 2015 to 2022 to 9th and 10th across the OECD countries. And within this mix, as we all know, England performed better than Labour-run Wales or SNP-run Scotland, despite the higher funding. If we want to see what would happen under Labour in education, all we need to do is look to Wales. It is not an impressive performance. And in the latest Pearls assessment of reading for 10-year-old students across 57 education systems, England ranked 4th internationally. So I think we can all accept that these are good things. So this Conservative government believes that there is a broad public benefit in the provision of education. And this is why many education and training services are exempt from VAT. And this includes an exemption on independent school fees. But Labour does not seem to recognise the public good, as my right honourable friend just mentioned. They want to charge VAT on school fees and end business rates relief for private schools, taxing aspiration and inevitably putting more pressure on state schools.
Will the Minister give way on that point?
Certainly.
I thank the Minister for giving way, and I'm very blessed to have two excellent independent schools in my own constituency with Worksop College and Ranby House, and I speak as a former head of an independent school myself. But we also have some excellent state schools. We have the Outward Grange Academies Trust, outstanding schools giving outstanding opportunities to local pupils. Does the Minister agree with me that the knock-on effect is not spoken about enough with this, and that what Labour are actually doing is adding to the capacity problems and actually neglecting the state sector by what they are doing with the independent sector?
Yes, my honourable friend makes a really important point, and that was repeated by many colleagues today, because an introduction of 20% VAT will just have two impacts. It will either push up prices or lead to cutting costs somehow. And it's just intuitively obvious that if we push large numbers of pupils from the private sector into the state sector, that will just mean inevitably pressure on the state sector and therefore cost even more for members of the public. The numbers that are suggested by the opposition just simply do not stack up. It is ill thought out policy. The full knock-on impact has not been properly considered. And VAT is an incredibly complex area, and it is not simple to make some blanket policy without considering the full impact. My honourable friend, the member for Worcester, mentioned as well, that, and actually several honourable members mentioned that, you know, not every private school is some kind of Eton. We have got people in very deprived areas of the country who are exceptionally vulnerable, who rely on our private schools in order to provide the type of education they cannot get from the mainstream system. Yeah.
Independent schools like Eton and Harrow and those major schools give 100% bursaries to children from disadvantaged areas to give them a chance to really skill up and to benefit for their own communities as well. And to have that is a really amazing thing.
Yes, the honourable lady is absolutely correct. I say the broader societal impact and benefit of many of our private schools is considerable. And of course, one of the many reasons why many of them, not all of them, but many of them have charitable status as well. Opening up for sports provision, all sorts of benefits actually can be achieved. And of course, the government is not alone in having concerns about Labour's current policy, because Labour's own Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury spoke out against their planned tax rise before he joined the front bench, telling students he did not believe the policy would bring in the money that his party was promising. And of course, that has not stopped Labour spending money several times over already, and they do not have a plan to pay for the potential incremental costs. Mr. Chairman, I'll bring my comments to a close, but I must express, before I finish, a slight disappointment. Much as it's always a pleasure to have the Honourable Lady in the chamber, I'm normally faced in these debates from my opposite number, the member for Ealing North. And I must share an irony in this situation. Mr. Chairman, I stand here today as a proud product of a comprehensive state school education. Nevertheless, supporting the role of private schools in the UK and the principle of freedom of choice, aspiration, opportunity and social mobility, whereas my Labour counterpart is a product of a private school system and is yet advocating a policy that could potentially restrict access to the very system for which he has himself benefited, as has indeed many members of the opposition benches. I find that quite ironic and quite hypocritical, but I will never criticise somebody for the choices made by their parents. We don't do that on this side of the chamber. But a little bit of humility in this debate might be appreciated as well. Mr. Chairman, a good education for all is a priority for this government, and I hope honourable members across the House will work with us to deliver it.
Thank you. Andrew Lure, we have 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Henderson. I just want to express my sincere thanks to so many colleagues. I thought about an adjournment debate with this, but I'm so pleased that rather than standing in the chamber talking to myself, I've actually got a large number of people here to actually take part in the debate and make such useful and constructive contributions. I think the proposed policy fails both in terms of principle, the principle of freedom of choice, the principle of education being free of VAT, and this idea that you can pick, well, we want VAT to not be on education apart from the bits that we don't like, apart from the bits we can have a bit of a class warrior go at. But it also fails in practice, and for every, for every report in one direction, I have others. The EDSK report and the Baines-Cutler report are independent reports, very carefully researched, and do prove that this money that is being spent dozens of times already doesn't actually exist in the first place. To me, it feels like the current leader of the opposition's version of fox hunting. I need to come up with something red meaty to throw at my left to say, look, we're still socialists and we'll bash the rich and the elite. So Tony Blair did it with fox hunting, and now it's independent education. And the difficulty with that is that this is so much more profound and so much more damaging, even than that was, which did cause problems for rural communities. This is much worse, much broader based, much more damaging. And I'm delighted that so many colleagues have been able to pick up so many key points. And I think the special educational needs point that has been made by several colleagues is particularly potent. And I shall certainly try and take that bit in my ongoing work as chairman of the All-Party Group for Independent Education. Thank you, Mr. Henderson.
Hear, hear. Thank you. The question is that the House has considered independent school fees and VAT. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting stands adjourned.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.